Hey, Tommy. What's
Hey,
up?
what's up, man? It's been fucking miserable, dude. Fucking finals, I'm sure yours sucked too, but dude, I had so many I'm so fucking tired, dude.
Well, we could play a game.
Yeah, sure, dude. Fucking, I don't care, dude. Fucking pop anything, and what do you got?
Beyond Two Souls.
Dude, fuck Beyond Two.
All right, welcome to a very belated episode of Two Tone Reality. I'm Brennan.
And I'm Rez.
And what we're going to be talking about today is Beyond Two Souls, the PS3 exclusive that came out a few months ago. So, Raz, you know a little bit about Quantic Dream's history. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Alright, so Quantic Dream started as a small developer. Their first noteworthy title was Indigo Prophecy on the PS2. Their lead director, I believe, or I think it's lead director, is David Cage. He's the one you see in all the interviews. You see him at conferences and stuff. He usually talks a lot about his game at E3 and stuff because Sony likes to have him there to show the more cinematic side of what their systems are capable of. And so the first game was Indigo Prophecy, which was kind of a cult game. And since then, it's kind of blown up beyond that. He had, before Heavy Rain came out on the PS3, which was another big selling point for the PS3, they had a tech demo called The Audition, which featured a rendered woman using mocap auditioning for some part in some unknown play or stage play, movie, something like that, which was really impressive. And then Heavy Rain came out and kind of got pretty good reviews, a little mixed, but mostly good critical acclaim. And now we're here, and we've seen Quantic Dream showed a demo probably about a year ago. I can't remember specifically what it was called, but it was basically a robot assembly line.
Right.
One of the robots becomes sentient, and it's really emotional. I actually kind of liked it. I thought it was really cool, and I thought a lot of people were disappointed that the game actually had nothing to do with this. And that was kind of the tech demo leading up to where we are now, which is Beyond Two Souls.
All right, so I played Beyond Two Souls pretty much when it first came out. I was actually pretty excited for the game because I think, unlike you, I actually really enjoyed Heavy Rain.
Yeah, I was the one that was warning you not to buy it for months and months before it came out.
Well, a lot of people warned me not to buy the game, and I didn't listen because, like I said, I really liked Heavy Rain, and I had liked Indigo Prophecy when I had played it very long ago. But I couldn't have been more wrong about this game, and I think a lot of reviewers out there, critics, they were actually pretty harsh on the game as well. They're pretty mediocre reviews.
It's kind of mixed. It depends on the sources, but yeah, a lot of the reviewers started to hang towards the lower end of the spectrum, especially as time drug on. So yeah, I guess we can probably go into why there's such mixed reviews. The critical acclaim for it was kind of mixed. User reviews generally on the higher score end of the spectrum. The low reviews you see are people that are saying it's not a game and these little petty arguments, which I don't really think gets the heart of why this game isn't very successful in our opinion. So the game is it takes place over the 20 years?
It's basically you're following this girl named Jodie Holmes, and you're basically following her from her childhood up to adulthood, and basically following her life,
but not in that order.
But not in that order. So yeah, I mean the game takes place throughout probably a 20-year period, but the problem is that it takes place in just intervals, and it cuts, so you'll go from age 3 to age 15 back to age 6, and it's just it kind of becomes really jarring as far as how the presentation of the overall game is.
This is probably one of the chief complaints I had about the game, is that you have before you start the game, it shows a timeline on every load screen,
yeah.
And it shows you that it starts at the end and it goes to the beginning, and the game kind of thinks it's Memento, but the problem is that Memento has a thread that goes through all the pieces of the movie and kind of connect it together. Whereas in this game, one moment you're a CIA agent infiltrating some Middle Eastern thing that we don't know anything about. We're just getting a file or something. And then the next moment you're on a Navajo farm or something helping people rustle cattle.
Well, the thing about Memento, since you brought Memento up, is that Memento actually, there is a purpose for why it's told in the way it's told. Whereas Beyond, it's presented to you in this fashion, but the end result, it doesn't make any sense as to why it was presented to me in that way, other than just trying to be different than every other game and have it chronological.
It just seems like it wanted it as a talking point, basically. Where someone can say, oh, it's real cool because it's out of order. And it's but why is it out of order? and you don't know because why wouldn't it just be told chronologically? I feel like I would have had a much one of the problems I have with that, the jarringness of it, the reason that's important to me is that the emotional tone of the game is not consistent because it's moving constantly between different parts of her life. And Jodie as a kid is very different from Jodie as a teenager, is very different from Jodie as a CIA ghost agent. Literally ghost agent, not like a ghost as in like a hidden agent. I mean a ghost as in tracking down actual ghosts. But that point aside, is you have moments where it's kind of funny, where she's kind of having a fun time having a snowball fight with friends. Yeah. And then you have a moment where she's in a bathroom stall in a Middle Eastern embassy or something, and she's bleeding from her nose, and she gets betrayed, and it's just really hard to connect these all together and to feel one consistent emotion. And so it's just constantly going between happy, sad, angry, revenge, vengeful, that sort of thing.
Well, the problem is that this is a storytelling device in order to have some sort of end result to where it all makes sense in the end as to why they gave you it the way that they gave you it in this nice little messed up package. So there always has to be this sort of like payoff as to why they're telling you the story this way. But this game, it literally does not make any sense as to why they tell you it this way, other than just to try and be different.
I got to the end, and I expected there to be some reason that it's told that way, and it's never really alluded to. There doesn't seem to be any real point to it. It's just...
There's no payoff.
And it's funny, because even though it's told out of order, it still has to be a normal story. It's not like Memento, where it can be told out of order, and there's a big twist based on that. It still has to be told in that order, where you see Jodie grow up and doing different things, and then you get to a villain, and then there's the twist, and then you have to defeat the bad guy at the end, and that's basically how it plays out. And that's another big issue with it, is that it's constantly jarring, and you just suddenly get to a point in the game where someone is just suddenly a villain for no reason, and it's in the last, hour, 30 minutes or so that they're introduced. Yeah. And you finally have a clear villain, and within that much time, you're done with the game, and you've defeated the villain that you didn't know existed for most of the game.
Yeah, and the way that they present this villain to you, it just seems so rushed and so unnecessary. It just seems like they didn't know how to properly end the game. So what they did was they just completely added a new... What they did throughout this game, which I really don't like any games doing, is they basically invent plot devices just for the sake of moving the movie, or I just called it a movie, yeah. And for the sake of moving the game forward. Mm-hmm. And I really hate that, because it just seems...
It feels like after so many plot devices, it just feels like in a movie, normally you have an hour and a half, 2 hours. Lord of the Rings, 3 hours, like up to 3 hours. And you have plot devices, but they're all generally... There's just a few, usually, in a good movie. And the audience just kind of accepts it and moves on. But when it happens so many times in so many moments of Jodie's peril, where a plot device swoops in at the last minute to save her, suddenly it takes all the tension out of the game, because it doesn't matter what kind of fix Jodie gets herself into. There will be a plot device to swoop in and snatch her up at the last second from the jaws of defeat.
Well, so, the great thing about the plot devices too is that it only caters to certain characters as well.
Yeah.
So I think you'll remember, there's a certain plot device towards the end of the game that they introduce just to move the story forward in the last hour. And the funny thing about it is that it only applies to the two main characters and not the other person that's actually in the situation with them.
And even then, you find out afterwards that it didn't matter anyway for them. The one guy dies, even though he's wearing the plot device that's supposed... The only purpose of this plot device is to protect him from something that then swoops in and kills him anyway. And then the main character removes the plot device, and it suddenly doesn't matter at all. Mm-hmm. She's completely safe. It doesn't... And she walks up, and depending on your choices, she basically survives a nuclear explosion point blank, and it doesn't seem to really do anything to her.
Seems to make a lot of sense to me.
And so if it sounds like we're putting a lot of undue emphasis on the story, the reason is because David Cage did too. The reason we're grading this as if it were a movie is because that's very much what the game thinks it is. And it is one of those complaints that people keep saying where it's not a game, it is a game. And that's the reason it's bad, is because it's not a game. I don't think it's inherently good to be a game. It is nice to have gameplay when I turn on my console, computer, whatever. Mm-hmm. But that's fine. If you want to have an interactive fiction work, that's fine. It's been done before. We have Walking Dead, which was widely successful last year.
Which you personally don't like, but you still understand
I
that
still
it does a
understand
better
that
job than...
It's not that I dislike the game because it's not a game. I just don't really care too much for the story. But that also probably had a lot to do with me falling out with Walking Dead in general. But we have games like that, and if you want something that's more gamey than that, even we have examples like Alan Wake, and I mean even God of War is fairly cinematic. But
well, I mean, you could use Uncharted as a really good example too, because Naughty Dog, I think what they're masters of is creating stories using cinematics, but blending in the gameplay to where it's almost just one fluid motion throughout.
Seamless.
Yeah, it's seamless.
Yeah, and so I wouldn't feel so bad about this game if it tried to do anything beyond making just a really shallow kind of oddball movie that drags on for the better part of 8 to 10 hours. But the gameplay is almost non-existent. There's part of the way into, maybe a third of the way into the game, they introduce stealth elements. And you're like, oh,
and it's only for one segment of the game.
Yeah, no, you sit there and you're like, oh, stealth element, this will be fun. Finally we're starting to get some gameplay. That we've had some gameplay up to that point, but it's mostly been just saying choices to people and walking to this part of the room and talking to this person. But then they finally introduce what looks to be real gameplay, where you peek out from cover and you run to other cover and you have your ghost buddy distract things for you and all this other stuff. And then for 4 hours, I don't think you use it at all. It's completely not there, to the point where when it appears again, it took me a while to remember what I was supposed to do, where I was like, oh, it's one of those things they showed me way back when. I think there's maybe a total of 2 or 3 instances the entire game where you use those controls. And the rest of the game, the bulk of the controls are either conversations or a very odd combat system where it's an analog combat system. It revolves solely around the analog stick. And the movements on screen are supposed to... Yeah, it's supposed to... The movements on screen are supposed to correlate with the direction you should move the analog stick in. The problem is that it's obvious. It's not obvious sometimes which direction you should be moving the analog stick. And when you have to react in 1 or 2 seconds, and you're sitting there trying to make sense of what's going on screen, it becomes a hazy mess a lot of the time.
Well, the problem is that that kind of like mechanic, it's not consistent throughout the game. So you have some instances where you'll be generally focused on Jody and trying to, okay, should I move left or right because I'm fighting this one guy? But then sometimes you only have like a split second to determine if the guy's kicking from the left or right, so that you can basically press the opposite way on the analog in order to avoid his kick. But in the end, we've come to realize that it doesn't really matter, does it?
It doesn't matter, because it seems that the developer was aware, too, that this combat system was very obtuse, and so one of the measures they took to make sure that this didn't frustrate players was there's no fail state in the game. There's no way to... Jody can't die in the game. At least during the bulk of the gameplay, it's not possible for her to die. They didn't leave it as a potential choice. Which is interesting, because in past games it has been a choice of the branching story, is to see what happens when a particular individual doesn't make it in one situation, and it was cool. It was cool to see the story continue without the assistance of every character there all the time. But in this game, David Cage opted out of that. I assume probably not to frustrate players, because it's based around one character, and if they die, that's basically just going to be the end of the game. And so. No matter how much you fail, there are moments where dogs are chewing on your arms, or you fall off a train. If you fail, and Jody will just brush herself off.
Yeah, there's always some way to where you get out of the situation alive.
Yeah, and for the first couple hours, this illusion isn't quite apparent, so it's okay. But the more you play the game, the more you start to realize, eventually you'll just be compelled to if you're like me, just leave the controller alone and see what happens in one of those sequences, and Jody will get the absolute snot beat out of her, like absolutely beaten to a pulp, and then in the very next scene she'll dust herself off and be like, all right, well, time to continue on with the next page of the story.
Well, the very next scene is going to be 10 years later, so
it doesn't matter. Yeah, it doesn't matter, because she's healed all her wounds, and you, I mean, all those choices you made, they happened, but you won't see them in any meaningful sense.
So let me talk one more thing about the gameplay. Let me bring up the whole gameplay as far as Aiden goes. Because I know that they were talking a lot about, all right, well, you actually get to control Aiden, and you actually get to help or use him to help Jodie, in her journey, help the story progress. And I think that was a really big mistake, and I just don't think that it really worked.
They
very
didn't
well.
really. I don't know if it was technical limitations or time limitations, or they just didn't have enough time to explore so many choices at the same time. But in the demo, I seem to remember in the demo, I'd have to go back and look for certain, but in the original demo, they show a scene with Jodie, and basically in a police shootout, she's held up in front of what looks to be an old movie theater or something,
Mm-hmm.
and there's SWAT closing in all around her, and David Cage is there, and he's doing his best Peter Molyneux impression and talking about how this is the point where the story really branches, and Aiden he can interact with anything he sees, and the small difference between this demo and the actual game is that you don't see dots on everything that you can influence. So in this, he looks like he's dynamically, it's very organic. He's going around, he's like, what do you want me to mess with? This helicopter? I'm going to go up and I'm going to crash this helicopter into the ground. And it looks just so interactive and so interesting. You can make one of the people, you can take control of a police officer and shoot the other police officers and all this nonsense. And then you get into the game, and they couldn't just have you going around all willy-nilly basically trying to use Aiden to manipulate random objects. So they had to mark it in some gameplay sense. So there's little dots on all the things you can interact with.
Mm-hmm.
There's like 5 dots at a time in a street
If
full
that.
of something like 40 cops, a helicopter, cars, grenade launchers, all kinds of stuff. There's 5 interactive objects at a time.
Well, I seem to remember when playing that game that portion of the game specifically, and I remember that Jodie is in cover, and you can see all of the cops and all the cars or all the FBI agents, whatever. You see all these people, and she starts whispering to Aiden. She's like, "Distract them, Aiden." So basically, then you control Aiden, and it's like, all right, what can I do? All right, well, I can go over to this. Even though there's like 100 police cars, I can go to this one specific
Yes.
police car, and I can like make the alarm go off,
Yes.
and that'll distract them for like 2 seconds, so I can run in the theater and get away from them.
But it feels very artificial and just it's inconsistent. It's like I can make this police officer commit suicide, I can make this one shoot the other police officers, but the other police officers I can't do that. The other cars I can't do that. The other helicopters, the other snipers, it's just very inconsistent. Aiden seems to be very specific in his taste for what he can and can't control in the game. And it's those plot devices we talk about where it suddenly starts to feel like I'm in control, but only of a very specific set of buttons that the developer has given me and handed me, and it doesn't really matter which ones I've pressed because the developer's already laid out what will happen before I've actually pressed any of them.
Yeah, and I mean, since we're kind of we're kind of going towards the whole the whole talk about choices. You can talk about storyline choices, and how to me they're just so very superficial. It seems like every single choice that you have has no consequence.
No, I've seen multiple playthroughs, and I've heard you talk about it, and other friends talk about it, and it seems like everyone pretty much, once they finish the game, ends up having finished basically the same journey. There's very, very small aesthetic differences, but there's no huge overarching changes where it's like that one thing I did influenced the whole rest of the game. It influences... And it's the way the game is broken up, too, where it's non-chronological, and I feel like that might have been specifically for this, is because they couldn't make choices carry through, and it was easier to hide that by making it so you didn't remember what you had done in the sequence right before another sequence, because you don't play the sequences in order. You play them in a mixed bag,
Yeah.
and each time you pull one out, you don't remember what happened before it, so the choices you made, yeah, sure, they probably led to you loving this one guy, or you not having this one friend dying or something. You just kind of accept it, and it's like, yeah, I guess the choices, that kind of makes sense with the choices I made, and you just kind of brush it off.
I really liked what you were talking about when you're talking about the one guy's playthrough where the entire game he was a complete asshole to the character Ryan. Like every single time he had the chance, he was like, "I don't love you," or "Get the fuck away from me." Whatever choices he had, he was always just like, "Stay away from me." And then at the end, he still has the choice to go away with Ryan and live happily ever after with him, and that just seems so weird to me.
Ellen Page sits there and thinks fondly of like, man, I will really miss him, even though every choice that's been made in the game so far has been, fuck you, Ryan, I hate you. And she's sitting there and she's like, man, do I choose my friends or do I choose this guy that I love so much that I've told him I fuck you every time I've seen him?
So basically, that goes into the choice as well, because all of basically when it comes down to the end and you're giving your last few choices, you get like three different choices at the end. It basically means that every other choice that you made throughout the game doesn't matter at all. It serves no purpose whatsoever.
It's purely aesthetic, and it's purely in the moment. It makes you feel like you're influencing anything, but immediately afterwards, the big kid comes and just stomps your sandcastle down, and you're back to the same thing everyone else had. And you don't ever get to see any of your choices really flourish in any meaningful way. And so basically, after a while, it's like I can't die, I can't make real choices, and there's no real gameplay. There's no the combat is not satisfying, and it's so.
The gameplay in general is not.
Yeah,
satisfying.
the gameplay is something to be ignored. If there's, I can't imagine anyone walking away from this game and thinking, "Man, I really enjoyed. I didn't like the story, but the gameplay was really solid. I really got my $60
These games to me have always been marketed as a very like a cinematic experience. Like I was looking it up, and I think it's Wikipedia that even calls it a cinematic drama.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the game is displayed as.
And I would think that too. I would think, okay, well, I'm more a gamer. I don't really delve as much into cinema, so I would play it and I would think like, okay, so I guess I don't really get it, but I'm sure like a cinema buff would get it. But then I talk to you, who is a cinema buff, and you don't seem to enjoy it either. So I sit here and I wonder what market this game is trying to go for, because it's just. I assume it's just the lowest brow of a combination of I'm kind of a gamer and I watch movies, and that's basically what it's going for is a mix of the two.
There are some really good games out there that, in my opinion, really do the cinematic justice. But as far as this game goes, I feel like it tries too hard to be a movie.
The biggest problem I had with it was just the movie part of it doesn't mesh with the gameplay part, so you have these odd things where you feel like they're at ends with each other. Like we were mentioning earlier, how the combat doesn't quite work because it's a movie and it doesn't want to show you button prompts, but at the same time you need them because you don't know what direction you're supposed to be pressing. And you were talking about the simplest example where you're fighting against another person, and that's theoretically the most obvious example. When a punch is going this direction on the screen, you should be pressing this direction on the screen. But then you get into I don't know if you remember the part where you're running away from the cops through the woods.
Yes, I remember.
Dodging a tree is very hard to do when there's a lot of trees in my path and it's the cinematic behind the shoulder camera and there's a tree coming at me. And I mean, theoretically, a tree goes up and down, so I can dodge left or right. But the game has a very specific designation. Left might not be correct. It might be right, and I don't know that until I press left and Jody bumps right into the tree. But it doesn't matter because Jody's not going to die anyway.
Yeah, so the game has this. It does have this very linear path that it does make you follow, but at times it tries to make it come off as if you do have a choice as to where to go or what to do. But the end result's always the same, and you're always going to end up going to the same, from point A to point B.
It's much happier with the illusion of choice than actual choices and following through with them. And so I guess if I were to close out my thoughts on it, my biggest problem with it as a gamer is just that the game part of it is neglected basically, and that's fine. I don't need every one of my games to be Devil May Cry or I don't know, Counter-Strike. They don't all have to be very, very gamey experiences where I control every moment of what's happening to my character. But at the same time, if you're not going to do that, you need to give me something. And this game is trying to give me an 8-hour-long movie that's very jarring and inconsistent. As it's not hard to follow. It's just strange to follow.
It just seems like it's not focused on one particular thing.
It wants to present a whole bunch of ideas. There's the idea of the other world, and there's the idea of nationalism, and there's the idea of growing up without a parent, and all these things combining, and they don't create a coherent. There's no synergy there. They don't create a coherent whole. And so I don't get a story out of it. I clearly don't get gameplay out of it. And so it's just it falls very flat for me. So the only people I can see really liking it are people who maybe really relate with the main character, which I don't know if many people can. Relate with someone who can control a ghost and is in the CIA and infiltrates underground submarine Chinese ghost bases. Don't know a lot of people like that, but I'm sure they're somewhere. And I'm sure I would recommend this game very highly to them. But to anyone else who doesn't really relate with that, I don't understand why you would play this game.
So if you can talk to spirits, then you'll like this game.
Yes,
basically.
if you talk to ghosts on a regular basis, this game is for you. Otherwise, it does not
Yeah,
get highly rated.
if not, you probably want to stay away from it.
You might want to try Uncharted or Alan Wake or some other game that's more relatable.
Okay, let me close this out from my standpoint by saying that I don't think that Ellen Page or Willem Dafoe did a bad job.
No,
Actually, I think they did a pretty great job, all things considered.
Mm-hmm.
They're both phenomenal actors in my opinion, and I think that it really just suffers because of the vision that David Cage had for it.
It's just all the performances handed to Ellen Page and Willem Dafoe's characters are handled very well. For those who don't know, this game was all mocapped with the actual actors, and they wanted to preserve basically the lip syncing was the big issue, and so they had to mocap the actual actors so that the lips were constantly synced with what they were saying. So as they were giving the performances, basically they were mocapped, and those are great. Those are fine. They're two very good actors. They've both shown their stuff time and time again. And that's not at fault here. In fact, I don't think any of the performances of any of the actors really were.
No,
really
that was actually probably the best part of the game.
The highlight of the game for me was in a lot of games you get that voice acting that feels very weird and jarring and gamey, where the pauses in between people talking and the way that they look at each other in the cutscenes is kind of odd. This game didn't really have that. Certainly not as much as I saw in like Heavy Rain, for instance, is one that I have huge complaints about. And obviously anything older than that's going to be worse.
Yeah.
But that part, the actual presentation of what was being shown to me was great. It's just that the overall plot and idea and contrivances of the story are just bad. Even if you treat it as a valid game, it's just the gameplay is lackluster and the story is terrible, so why would you play it? It's an 8-hour long, very contrived, strange, non-chronological movie with the same ending no matter how many times you play it.